welcome to the third instalment of the Chronicles. In this episode, I will investigate the twisted life of Dean Corll, also known as the Candyman or Pied Piper. If you enjoy, please remember to like, comment and subscribe with post notifications on, and thank you for your support on my previous videos. Dean Arnold Corll was born December 24th, 1938 in Fort Wayne, Indiana, to parents Arnold Edwin Corll and Mary Emma Robinson, who divorced in 1946. His mother sold the family home and moved to Memphis in a trailer home. His father was then drafted to the US Air Force. The parents remarried in 1950, but this was short-lived as they divorced again in 1953, with the mother keeping custody of both kids. After the second divorce, Dean's mother married a travelling clock salesman called Jake West, and they moved to a small town in Texas called Vidor. In 1955, Dean's half-sister Joyce was born. Following this, Dean's mother and stepfather started a family-run candy company called Peak and Prince. Dean worked long hours for the candy company. He and his brother had the responsibility of running the candy-making machines and packing the final product up, which his stepfather sold on the road. Dean graduated from Vida High School in 1958, aged 19. Shortly after this, his family moved to Houston so they could sell more of the product in the city. In 1960, Dean moved to Indiana to live with his widowed grandmother, where he met a girl who proposed to him unsuccessfully in 1962. He lived in Indiana for 2 years in total. He returned to Houston in 1962 to again help the family with the candy business, where he moved into his own apartment above the shop. Dean's mother eventually divorced Jake West in 1963 and started a new candy business called Corll Candy Company. In the same year, one of the male employees accused Dean of making sexual advances on him, which led to Dean's mother firing him. After he was fired, he searched for a new job. He was eventually drafted into the US Army on August 10, 1964, aged 27. However, he only served for 10 months, and on June 11, 1965, he was given an honourable discharge as he said he was needed in his family business. Following his discharge, he resumed his position as vice president of the family's candy business. The competition between their business and Dean's former stepfather's business was fierce, so he decided to start to work more hours to try to increase the demand for his family product. In 1965, the business moved to 22nd Street, where they were located directly across from Helms Elementary School. He was known to give free candy to the school kids, in particular teenage boys. This is where he got the nickname the Candyman and the Pied Piper. In 1967, Dean, aged 29, made friends with 12-year-old David Owen Brooks, who was one of the 6th grade students he gave candy to. Brooks would often ask Dean for cash, and he would always give it to him. Eventually, in 1969, a sexual relationship began to form between the pair, where Dean paid Brooks cash or gave him gifts to be able to perform oral sex on the young child. Brooks's parents were divorced. His father lived in Houston, but his mother lived in Beaumont, 85 miles away. In 1970, aged 15, he moved to live with his mother, and whenever he came back to visit his father, he would also visit Dean, who allowed him to stay at his apartment. By the time Brooks dropped out of high school, Dean's mother and half-sister had moved to Colorado after the failure of her third marriage and closure of the family candy company in 1968. Following the closure of the company, Dean worked as an electrician for the Houston Lighting and Power Company. In the space of 3 years, between 1970 and 1973, Dean killed a minimum of 28 victims, all males between the ages of 13 to 20. Most victims were abducted from Houston Heights. With most of the abductions, he was assisted by either one or both of his accomplices, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. Many victims were either friends with the accomplices, friends of Dean, or previous employees of the candy company. His victims were lured into one of the 2 vehicles he owned, a Ford Econoline van or a Plymouth GTX. He usually gave the offer of a party or a lift. When the victims arrived at his house, the child would be given alcohol and drugs until they passed out. They were then stripped naked and tied to Dean's bed or a torture board. Once they were restrained, the victim would either be sexually assaulted, beaten, tortured, and then eventually killed by strangulation or being shot. The bodies were then tied in a plastic sheet and buried in either a rented boat shed, a beach, on the Boulevard Peninsula or woodland near Lake Sam Rayburn or a beach in Jefferson County. On multiple occasions, he forced the victim to phone home to their parents with explanations of their absence. His first known murder was committed on September 25, 1970, where he killed an 18-year-old college freshman, Jeffrey Conan. He did this by strangulation, and he buried him under a large boulder in High Island Beach. Around the time of this murder, David Brooks, now aged 15, saw Dean sexually assaulting 2 teenage boys. Dean promised to buy Brooks a car if he kept quiet, which he did, and eventually got him a green Chevrolet Corvette. After this, Dean began to offer Brooks $200 for any boy he could lure to his apartment. On December 13, 1970, Brooks lured in 2 14-year-old boys named James Glass and Danny Yates, who were eventually raped, strangled, and buried in the boat shed on November 17th. 6 weeks after this, Brooks and Dean lured another 2 teenage boys, Donald and Jerry Waldrop, into his van, who were raped, tortured, strangled, and buried in the boat shed. Between March and May 1971, Dean abducted and killed 3 more victims: 15-year-old Randall Harvey, 13-year-old David Hillgeest, and 16-year-old Gregory Malley Winkle. After these murders, Elmer Henley, who was a friend of David Hillgeest, pinned missing posters around the city. On August 17, 1971, the pair abducted 17-year-old Reuben Haney Watson, who was strangled and buried in the boat shed. Elmer Henley has been mentioned numerous times within this story. It was at this point he became properly involved. In the winter of 1971, Brooks introduced Henley to Dean as an intended victim. However, Dean believed he would make a good accomplice and also offered him the $200 per victim that he was paying Brooks. For several months, Henley denied the offers, but in 1972 he accepted the offer because his family were in a very poor financial circumstance. Henley's first victim was abducted in late February 1972. He said they told the boy they were going to Dean's to smoke marijuana. The boy, whose identity isn't known, was then handcuffed and gagged. 1 month later, on March 24, 1972, Brooks, Henley and Dean encountered 18-year-old Frank Aguirre, who was invited back to drink alcohol and smoke marijuana. Henley apparently begged Dean to not assault and kill Aguirre, however Dean refused. 1 month after that, Henley assisted Brooks and Dean in the abduction of 17-year-old Mark Scott, who was well known to both Brooks and Henley. He was raped, tortured, strangled, and eventually buried at High Island Beach. Henley also helped with the abduction of Billy Bulsh, Johnny DeLome, Billy Ridinger, 17-year-old Stephen Sickman, 19-year-old Roy Bunton, Wally J. Simo, Richard Hembry, Richard Kepner, and Joseph Lyles. On March 7th, 1973, after moving around different premises for a while, moved again to 2020 Lamar Drive. Nobody was killed between February 1st and June 4th, 1973. This was apparently due to Henley moving away temporarily. However, from June onward, the rate of killing rose dramatically. On June 4th, Henley and Dean abducted 15-year-old William Ray Lawrence, who after 3 days of torture was strangled and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. Less than 2 weeks later, 20-year-old Raymond Stanley Blackburn met the same fate. On July 6, 1973, Henley lured Homer Luis Garcia back to Dean's, who was shot and left to bleed out in his bathtub, and eventually was buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. 5 days later, 17-year-old John Sellers was shot to death and buried at High Island Beach. In July 1973, Brooks left Henley and Dean to marry his pregnant fiancée, so Henley became Dean's only accomplice. He assisted in the abduction and murder of 3 youths between July 19th and 25th. Henley claimed they were the only 3 without Brooks. They were 15-year-old Michael Bulsh, Charles Cobble, and Ray Jones. Dean killed his last victim on August 3rd, 1973, a 13-year-old boy named James Stanton Draymler. He was lured to the house by Brooks and Henley and was tied to Dean's torture board, then raped and tortured and eventually strangled and buried in the boat shed. On the evening of August 7th, 1973, Henley, now aged 17, invited 19-year-old Timothy Caldwell Curley to a party at Dean's house. He was intended to be the next victim. The pair later left the house after sniffing paint fumes and drinking alcohol to get sandwiches. As they were doing this, they saw 15-year-old Rhonda Williams, who had been beaten by her drunk father, and they picked her up and took her back to Dean's house. Dean was initially very mad that he'd brought a girl back, saying Henley had ruined everything. Eventually he calmed down, and they all carried on drinking and smoking until they eventually passed out. Henley woke up to find himself in handcuffs, with his mouth taped and ankles tied together. Curley and Williams both lay beside him. Curley was stripped naked. Dean saw that Henley had awoken and removed the gag from his mouth. After doing this, Dean stated, "Man, you blew it bringing that girl home." After this, he shouted, "I'm going to kill you all, but first I'm going to have my fun." He dragged Henley into his kitchen and placed a .22 caliber pistol against his stomach. However, Henley promised to participate in the torture and murder of both Williams and Curley, so Dean released him. Dean handed Henley a hunting knife and ordered him to cut Williams' clothes off, then insisting he would rape and kill her as he did the same to Curley. Henley asked Dean if he could take Williams into a different room. Dean ignored him, and Henley then grabbed his pistol and began shouting, "You've gone far enough, Dean, and I can't go any longer. I can't have you kill all my friends." Dean replied by saying, "Kill me, Wayne," and "You won't do it." After he said this, Henley fired at Dean, hitting him in the forehead. However, he continued to move towards Henley, so he fired another 2 rounds, hitting Dean in the left shoulder. Dean then ran out the room. Henley then fired another 3 rounds into his back, and he died where he fell. At 8:24 a.m. on August 8, 1973, Henley called the Pasadena police. He admitted to killing Dean over the phone. After the call, the 3 went to wait out on Dean's porch for the police to arrive. Henley was put into custody and questioned about the killing of Dean. He explained that he shot him in self-defense. He then went on to explain that for almost 3 years, he and David Brooks had helped lure teenage boys to Dean, who raped and murdered them. He gave a statement saying he initially thought the boys were to be put into a sex ring, but soon after he realised that Dean was killing them himself. Henley admitted to assisting Dean in several abductions and murders, and he had actively participated in the torture of 6 or 8 victims. He then went on to explain where they were buried, and that Dean paid the boys $200 for each child they could lure back. Police were initially sceptical of Henley's claims. However, after he named 3 missing boys, the police realised there was something to his confession. Henley agreed to take police to the boat shed where most of the victims were buried. There were 8 in total found there, and the details of the state of their bodies is too graphic to put into a YouTube video. On August 8, 1973, Brooks went to the Houston police station and denied any participation in the murders, but admitted to knowing that Dean had raped and killed 2 youths in 1970. On the following day, Henley gave a full written statement detailing his and Brooks' involvement with the abduction and murders of multiple youths. He admitted to killing around 9 himself. He said that only 3 murders had been committed without Brooks. Henley then took the police to Lake Sam Rayburn, where 2 more bodies were discovered. Brooks eventually gave a full confession on August 9, 1973, admitting to being present at several killings and assisting in burials, although he still denied involvement in any murders. He then agreed to take police to High Island Beach to find more victims. After around a week of Brooks and Henley assisting police on burial sites of the victims, 27 were found in total, which was the worst killing spree in American history at the time. Victims' parents were very critical of the Houston Police Department, as they put many of the boys' disappearances down as runaways and never conducted any thorough investigations. On August 13th, a grand jury in Harris County was brought together to hear evidence against Brooks and Henley. The first witnesses to testify were Tim Curley and Rhonda Williams, who were present on the night Henley shot Dean. There was a further 6 hours of testimony from various people, and after this, the jury initially indicted Henley on 3 murder charges and Brooks on 1. Bail for each was set at $100,000, which is around $500,000 in today's economy. At the end of the trial, Henley was indicted for 6 murders and Brooks 4. Henley was not charged for the murder of Dean, as it was ruled as self-defense. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, please remember to like, comment and subscribe with post notifications on. I'll see you next time.